So welcome, everyone. I'm David Weinstein, the director of the Center on Japanese Economy and Business, also known as CJEB here at Columbia Business School, and the Carl S. Shoup Professor of the Japanese Economy at Columbia University. So I'm really delighted to have you here for today's event, Navigating Japan's Demographic and Technological Changes. And this is an event that is part of CJEB's Japanese Management Leadership Program. Before turning the floor over to our speaker, I just want to say a few words about the center for those of you who are new today. CJEB was founded in 1986, and our mission is to promote knowledge and understanding of Japan's economy and its business systems in an international context. CJEB is the only research center focusing on the Japanese economy and business setup within a university in North America, which makes us very special. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Yumiko Murakami. She is general partner of MPower Partners, Japan's first ESG-focused global venture capital fund. She is also the former head of the OECD Tokyo Center. Prior to the OECD, she worked for 20 years in the global financial industry, mostly as a managing director at Goldman Sachs in New York, London, and Tokyo. She's a leading authority on a wide range of economic policy issues, such as corporate governance, tax guidelines, diversity, education, trade, and innovation. I could spend a lot more time talking about her illustrious career, but I gather most of you would rather hear directly from Ms. Murakami. So we're going to do today's event as an open discussion. And I'm going to be sure to leave some time at the end for questions. So as the event is unfolding, you should make notes to yourself so that you have questions. You're ready to go when I open up the discussion. I also want to thank our corporate and individual sponsors listed in the booklet you received for your generous donations. These gifts allow us to continue developing and delivering exceptional program like today's. So thanks very much. So without any further ado, Ms. Murakami, please come join me up here.
Thank you.
Before we begin, I'd like to just start with a very American tradition of the Jiko Shokai, or self-introduction. Could you just talk a little bit about some of the key moments in your professional academic career that have brought you here?
Yeah, without feeling like I'm your parent generation, which I am, by the way. So the couple moments that I think important in my professional career that are probably worth highlighting here. First one is when I finished college in Japan. I was born and raised in Japan, by the way. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I wanted to get a job that was professional, something very exciting in terms of my professional growth. Turned out, this is the late 80s, it was impossible for women. And again, I'm feeling my age because it's a long time ago. In Japan, there was a law called Employment Equal Opportunity Law that was introduced in 1986, which is a little bit before I was finishing college. And that law supposedly was to give women or female students equal opportunities for jobs. It was a new thing, and even though the law was introduced, it really wasn't changing a lot of things in the Japanese business community, and quite frankly, Japanese companies were not hiring women for professional jobs. They're hiring women for, how do you call it? Tea making, the tea making ladies, whatever. So that was the first moment I realized it was very difficult or impossible for me to get a professional job. So that was the first realization that I needed to do something about this if I wanted to do something, something That's more professional. So that's when I went to the United States. I said, okay, maybe I should go to the United States. Maybe I go to graduate school. So I went to Stanford, not business school, Stanford graduate school. And then I got a job because I didn't want to go back to Japan to face the same problem. I got a job with the United Nations, which was a very interesting 3 years. And the second moment that kind of made me think about changing direction was when I realized I was very young and very naive. I wanted to save the world. I wanted to change the world for better. And that's why I joined the United Nations. But at the end of the day, I realized that it's the business, it's the economy that needs to stand on its own, in its own. And at the end of the day, no matter how much money you're getting from the government, no matter how much money you're getting from the United Nations, unless you can stand on your own, as a business person, as a private sector company, you're not going to last very long. You can get subsidies for whatever, very limited amount of time. So I want to understand how capital markets will work. And as a very young, naive United Nations professional, I realized I knew very little about how money moves from here to here. And that's when I decided that I wanted to study. I wanted to actually learn about the business, the capital markets that I didn't know much about. That was the second moment. I tried to get a job with private sector companies while I was working for the UN. No one would hire me. They all said, "Oh, you got a very interesting resume," because I went to, I went to school in Japan first. I went to school in America, and I got a job with the United Nations, which was kind of interesting, different, but I had no business experience. So all the companies I applied to at the time, they said, "Sorry, you're interesting, but we don't have a job for you." And that's when I decided to go to business school. A lot of you are in business school. I wanted to change my career direction. That was the second moment. So I went to business school. I went to Harvard Business School. And 2 years later, the companies who said, "Sorry, no job for you," they all gave me job offers. So it was actually the right thing for me to do, right? Because I was working in a public sector, wanted to save the world, very naive, interesting experience, but I realized my limitations back then. Went to business school, wanted to change my direction, got a job with Goldman as well. So that's when I joined Goldman Sachs. I joined Goldman Sachs, telling you, I got a job offer here, Goldman Sachs, New York, thinking I will work in New York, I will live in New York. This was 1994. You're too young now. I'm really feeling age. You don't remember, maybe you're not even born. But anyway, it was a terrible year for the Wall Street. The entire industry was bleeding, including Goldman. So a lot of things were just not working well for Goldman. A lot of people getting fired. I was in a training program, first-year associate training program, thinking, "Oh God, I hope I won't get fired." And one day, I got a call from my supervisor, and he said, "Sorry, things have changed." I'm thinking, "Oh my God, I don't have my job." Turned out I was getting transferred to London because things were changing. There's a lot of reorg. Anyway, I started my career in London, which turned out to be a really great thing because London is a very much international hub for capital markets today and also back then as well. So I was able to start my career at Goldman in London, really learning about different markets around the world. And that really helped me to develop my professional career as an international finance person. And then, whatever years later, I'm talking too much. I will keep it short. Okay, so whatever years, so I spent almost 20 years in the financial industry. And, I started to think, okay, what do I want to do next? I was able to do a lot of interesting things. I was able to learn a lot. And quite frankly, I was very happy with my career in the investment banking industry. But, in my 40s, I started to think about what other options do I have outside the investment banking industry that I was in. And when I was at Goldman, I saw quite a few people at Goldman who were working for Goldman Sachs or other firms on Wall Street, who are shifting their direction from the private sector, Goldman, to the public sector. People were moving from Wall Street to Washington, D.C. And that was really interesting for me. And they were able to really apply what they have learned as a banker in policy making. And it was really interesting for me to see how these people were making contributions in the public sector using their experience in the financial industry. So I was really inspired to see those people. And you probably know a lot of these people from Goldman who actually have moved on and have done a lot of things in the public sector. So I started to think about that option, and that's when I decided to apply for this job at OECD. And that's when I switched. Remember, my first job was United Nations, right? So I had exposure to the international organization space. And when I started to think about what can I do to really do something impactful using my experience as a banker. And I joined OECD, which is an international organization based in Paris. They specialize in economic policy, analysis and recommendations. They make recommendations on economic policies to member states, so countries, governments. So I joined them, and I was running the Tokyo office of OECD for seven or 8 years. The last moment I'm going to talk about the career, the turning point is I'm Japanese. I left Japan because I couldn't get a job as a Japanese woman, and I stayed in U.S. and UK. I had a great experience, and I went back to Japan. And I was really trying to figure out what was it that Japan was missing. It's a great country. If you have been to Japan, if you're from Japan, it's a great country, right? It's amazing in terms of the level of civility that you see in the community, in the society, and the culture. Food is amazing, but what is it that's missing? And I still cannot say that I have a perfect answer. But I knew one of the ingredients that were missing in Japan was, one, diversity, right? Not only gender diversity, diversity of thoughts. And two, it's part of diversity ingredients. But young people, young generation that need to speak up more in policy making, the direction of the companies if they're involved in companies in the private sector. And that was missing. It's a very seniority-based society, seniority-based everything. And I wanted to do something, hopefully, to change that dynamics. And that's when I decided that I wanted to do something to do with startups. And I had a financial background. I didn't have any startup experience, but I had investment background. And together with my Goldman Sachs colleague, Kathy Matsui, I don't know if you know Kathy Matsui, she was a vice chairperson of Goldman Sachs. She was there for 26 years, and she and I started Goldman in '94. So we were always friends, and we were always talking about, what is it? Japan is a great country. What's something missing? What is it? What's this one thing that's missing? And we had this mission of changing Japan. So together with Kathy Matsui, another founding member of the MPower company is Miwa Seki-san, who was my senpai, 1 year senpai at Harvard Business School. We met at business school a long time ago. So three of us, we got together and said, okay, this is what we're going to do, which basically is the fund that we're running, MPower Partners. We launched the fund in 2021, so almost 4 years. We invest in startups. We invest in Japanese startups. About 70% of capital is deployed in Japan, about 30% outside Japan. But outside Japan, startups that invest outside Japan have some kind of Japan angle. So that's what we do. And I know I spent too much time talking about it, but so different sort of turning points in terms of my career direction.
We'll have about 20 questions to go, so we should be done by tomorrow. No. So actually, though, I want to actually pick up where you just left off, which was you're starting MPower, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about MPower in terms of its investment philosophy, and also kind of one of the things I think a lot of people wonder about is when we think about the U.S. We see that there are a lot of startups. Most small firms in the U.S. are very young firms. They're under 10 years old. And in Japan, most small firms are old firms. They're over 10 years old. So part of what is different is that in the U.S., it seems to be the case that small firms either grow or they fail. And in Japan, they just stay small. And I guess a question I have is, first, kind of how would you characterize the startup culture or startup business in Japan? And kind of what is your investment philosophy and strategy in terms of startups in Japan?
Thank you. So it's true, there's so many zombie companies in Japan. We call it zombie companies because they just kind of stay around, even if they're not making a lot of money, but they kind of stay around. So it's true. So one of the things that I really hope we'll see in Japan, in that context, I mean, it's terrible to sound, but I like to see more bankruptcies. Love to see the bankruptcy rate going up. It's terrible to say this because you probably don't want to see companies going bust and people losing jobs, but that's what Japan needs. So when I was at OECD, I would see this interesting chart where you see OECD member states showing the bankruptcy rate and the new business, new companies that are set up. The rate between these the two rates. There is a positive correlation. Usually, you see positive correlation. The more bankruptcies you see, the more new companies you see. That's the normal pattern that we see in most OECD countries. So in Japan, usually it's a good thing, right? You don't have a lot of bankruptcies. But in Japan, the bankruptcy rate has been too extreme in terms of how low it's been. It's literally 1, 2, 3, 4%. I mean, depending on time, it can be 2%, can be 5%. But it's never like the average OECD range, which is about 10%. And that may be okay if you have a lot of new companies emerging. But in the case of Japan, we have very low bankruptcy rate and we have very few new companies growing. So I would love to be able to see the economy in Japan where there are more bankruptcies. There are always zombie companies. If zombie companies can revitalize and if they can regrow, then that's fine. But if zombie companies stay as zombie companies, they should exit from the market, right? And there should be a social safety net that will make the process a little easier. And that's what the government has to work on. That's the government responsibility. And I think if the government can do a better job to make sure that there's a certain level of safety net, zombie companies should be able to exit from the marketplace. That will make more room for new companies to enter. They can try their new products or new services that maybe never existed before, and that can potentially create new segments in the economy. So I'd love to see that. We're not seeing that yet. And I just got reappointed as the economic advisor for the new administration. Ishiba-san, as you know, is a new prime minister. And I have to be very careful in terms of the language I use, but that will be one of the most important messages that I like to deliver. Japan needs to see new blood coming in. For that to really have an effect in the economy, you need to make room for the new blood to really work in the system. What does that mean? That means you need to actually let zombie companies exit. And Ishiba-san, as you probably know, is known to be very proactively promoting this notion of 地方創生, which is basically to revitalize local economies, regional economies. And by the way, that concept, that notion is a very good one. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. The question is, how do you do it effectively? And I don't think the answer is to give them a bunch of subsidies and let these zombie companies, survive another 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. You can just write huge, packages and then, give them another, 5 years of 10 years of, lifetime. That's not the answer. So the question is, how do you make sure that there are ways for these companies to exit and new companies to enter? And then I hope that next government or the current government is going to work on it, because I do think the previous government, Kishida-san, has done a good job to really start this very, very important initiative to start this Japanese startup ecosystem going. He's done a really good job. So the momentum is there. Sakamoto-san is there, and we were in yesterday attending this conference. There's a lot of interest in Japan because things looks as if things are changing, right? I think things are changing. So the new government, for them to be able to carry out this program, they need to make sure that the policies that they're going to implement are not to prolong the life of these zombie companies. So that would be a very important element that we have to take into consideration when we talk about the startup ecosystem in Japan and how that's different from the ecosystem that we have seen in the United States. One thing that I would say about the U.S. is how dynamic it is. Bankruptcy rates in the U.S. so much higher. At the same time, there are a lot of new companies emerging. And by the way, that itself has its own problems, as you know, when it comes to social net, safety net, and income discrepancies and social divide, and that is a separate topic. But I do think Japan needs to address the fact that there are just way too many small medium companies that are zombie companies.
So that's really interesting, and I want to just follow up on a little bit of a conversation we had over lunch. You were at the OECD, and we talked about a mutual friend, Randy Jones, who is actually just here giving a talk. And one of the things he stressed, based on OECD data, is that Japan has more subsidies for small and medium enterprises than any other OECD country. Okay, and those especially for low interest lending, right? So in other words, you just roll the loans over is kind of the argument. Or what seems to be happening. And yet we see, right, and so part of, since you're in the front lines in this, I want to get a sense of, from your perspective, is the problem of Japan something in which, something where banks, have strong incentives from government pressure to keep rolling over loans to low-performing firms, and because of that, you don't get the failures, and that makes it harder to do startups because 70% of Japanese workers are in small firms, and you can't, they're not free when those firms don't fail, they don't get the incentive to kind of do something different. And so is that what to me is always puzzling, and you're also on all these very high-level government councils, right? It seems that there's a win-win situation for Japan, where Japan could cut funding for the small and medium enterprises, save money from the budget, and have a more dynamic economy. Is that a possibility for Japan?
I don't think I wish that was so simple that I could say, yeah, let's do that. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I mean, theoretically, it makes a lot of sense, right? But unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be that easy. It's in theory, that's what I was saying. That's what you were saying in terms of what might work really well in the Japanese economy. A number of complications / implications. One is the fact that the labor market is still extremely rigid, and there has to be more work on that front, because we need to talk about how labor market is going to be a crucial part of this entire dynamism that we want to create, right? So you can let these companies go bust, and what happens to these people, right? If the mobility within the labor market is not there, what happens to these people, right? Right, so that's number one. Number two, also the fact that there are a number of regulations slash, I guess, legal issues that are very difficult to address. If it's still not easy for companies to let people go, very, very difficult. So again, that's linked to this labor market issue as well. And another issue that we need to think about is how the society or the economy or the government is ready to assist or promote this reskilling needs. And at the end of the day, we want to see this dynamic labor market where people are trained or people are retrained so that they can be upgraded to maybe, they were doing something else, that industry is going away, and the people who were employed, workers who are employed in that particular industry, what happens to them unless they are reskilled or retrained? And if these people have opportunities to be retrained or reskilled, there are going to be opportunities for them to upgrade themselves and maybe do other things in other industries. And whether the country has enough infrastructure to support that kind of reskilling, retraining, which is really important for this digital economy, right? So I think Japan is one of the things that we talk a lot about in this government committee in terms of how Jintekishihon, it's basically investments into human capital. And that was a key phrase that Kishida-san loved to use, Jintekishihon. And that has a lot to do with the whole notion of this labor market functioning a lot more efficiently to optimize supply-demand between the economy that's dynamic, that's changing, that's creating a lot of interesting new businesses, and the people, supply, the talents, who can actually meet the emerging needs of a digital economy. And I think that requires a very high level of support from the government. And the government job is not to interfere private companies' businesses, but to supply that really help the economy move forward by helping to create this sort of safe, it's in a way it's a social safety, right? Because people, if they get laid off, they have opportunities to retrain themselves and maybe find other jobs. So I do think those are the things that need to take place. So it's, of course, if we can just cut off these subsidies and let these companies go, we could. But in reality, that would be a very difficult thing to do unless you have all these other sort of policies that are working really well so that there is a labor market that can really facilitate that kind of dynamic transformation of the economy and transformation of companies. And we are still working on it. I don't think we are there yet to say, yes, we're ready. Let these companies go. It's almost all companies in Japan are small, medium companies, right? Let them go. Let these zombie companies go. I said earlier, I want to see higher, bankruptcy rate. That was a little bit of extreme comment. But if all zombie companies go tomorrow or today, it would be a disaster, right? So I do think that's why I said, yes, I could say, yes, let's do that. But in reality, you need to take these steps to make sure that there are strong enough policies to support that sort of dynamic transformation that the Japanese economy has to take.
I mean, I think I'm going to move on, but I think it's very interesting, especially in light of the recent election in the United States, where kind of a U.S. model is just let them go and they will find new jobs. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right that the Japanese perspective is if there is a fire, if a company fails, the government needs to step in. And those are, I mean, I think you're absolutely right in terms of your description of what is happening in Japan. But I think it's also interesting how different countries have approached that problem differently. I want to push forward a little bit and talk a bit about your other work that you've done on government advisory panels. So, for example, there was Kishida's New Form of Capitalism panel. And I don't follow this stuff very closely, so I was kind of wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about, how what you think the current Prime Minister Ishiba is going to any policies he's going to implement or that they're thinking about implementing that will affect innovation or the entrepreneurial ecosystem or labor markets, or how will Japan look different, say, in 5 years than it looks today?
So one of the very important initiatives that Kishida-san launched in the last 3-4 years really was around wage increase. He really wanted to see Japanese wages going up. And if you're following the Japanese economy, finally we're starting to see signs of that happening. And but it's still very early, and hopefully it won't be very short-lived wage increase that we are starting to see. But I mean, if you come to Japan, you will probably notice that young people, especially young people in the 20s and university students that are graduating, they have amazing job market. It's incredible, and wages are going up, definitely going up. And like I said, that was a very important part of the Kishida-san's political agenda. Now, what happened was, so in Japan, usually when there's a new government, when there's a new prime minister, they replace the entire council, the panel. And I was sitting on Kishida-san's panel for 3.5 years, and it was a lot of work. I mean, it was great. I must say that I was very honored to be part of it. But when Kishida-san resigned, I'm like, oh, thank goodness, I have a little more free time. I got a phone call from the cabinet office and said, you're on again. I'm like, well, what do you mean? It was very unusual for the entire economic panel to continue with the new government. So we are all back. We, like I said, I got reappointed. And along with my fellow members of the panel, we had the first meeting with the new prime minister about 10 days ago. So one thing I would say is there is a very strong sense of continuity. The prime minister, as well as other cabinet members, other ministers, they do want to continue. This is really encouraging sort of direction that we're seeing in the economy, which is to see wages going up. So one thing I would say is I think that focus in terms of wage increase, that's likely to stay. So that's a good thing. So I don't think that's going to, the new prime minister is going to deviate from that focus in terms of wage increase. That's going to drive the economy. We had 30 years of deflation. What it does to your psyche, what it does to your, I lived in the US for a long time where there are a lot of inflations, and that's how I was used to think about the world. And when I went back to Japan, I realized, oh my God, this country has no inflation. But if you have no inflation for 30 years, that becomes norm. That becomes that becomes the way you look at the world. And that's kind of scary. You just don't think prices are going to go up. You just don't think your wages are going to go up. You just don't think your salary is going to go up. Nothing is going to go up. Prices are going to stay the same or even less tomorrow. And how damaging that is to your psyche as a business person or like a normal person living in I guess, it's good for retirees, by the way. But for the economy, it's terrible. So that's finally changing. So I would say the new government has the policy, the focus on the same wage increase. That's really good. In terms of what other potentially different or new initiatives Ishiba-san may have, I cannot comment on that as yet. It's too new, and quite frankly, you might have noticed that he has sort of changed his stance on some of the things that he said earlier before he was elected, and quite frankly, I'm not quite sure what he's going to say next in terms of his priority areas. But I would say, for sure, the wage issue is going to stay as number one priority. Another thing that maybe I'm very biased because I'm a venture capitalist. Another thing, hopefully he will continue to focus on, and he has already said that he would, is what I described earlier in terms of how the startup ecosystem is going to play a very instrumental role in the economy. So there are already a number of sort of new initiatives that are potentially coming out of the new government in terms of supporting the ecosystem of startups, in addition to the programs that have been already introduced by the previous government. So that's the second thing. The third thing that might, again, it's early days. We have a new president in America as well. So we just have to see how Ishiba-san does. I hope he will do a good job in terms of, establishing a very strong U.S.-Japan. Am I off? Okay. U.S.-Japan relations at the top level. But geopolitical tensions are likely to worsen, especially the U.S. and other countries. And in terms of economic security for the Japanese economy, for Japan, again, that was one of the very important political agenda items for the previous government. I do believe that's going to be even more important for Prime Minister Ishiba, and especially in light of the new government in the United States. I do believe that's likely to actually have even more tension from the new government in Japan. So those are the things that I foresee in terms of focus areas from the new government in Japan.
So while we're talking about new governments, as I'm sure you're aware, we have a new one here coming in. Your fund is, is an ESG focused fund, and very successful. One gets a sense in the United States that certainly DEI, the DEI agenda is going to come under a fair amount of attack from the government going forward. How do you think that's going to affect your fund or ESG more generally?
Yeah, but it's unfortunate. The whole ESG notion has been so politicized. It's a political issue. It should be a really economic topic, but at least in the context of the U.S., it's such a politicized topic that you can't even talk about. You can even discuss this whole ESG investment as a business topic, right? And that's a little bit different in Japan. Certainly different in Europe. So it's a very U.S. Specific situation in terms of how ESG has been so politicized. You can't even talk about it. So that's one. And number two, in terms of our fund, we're actually not social impact fund. We are very much like any other funds, any other VC funds. We are financially driven funds. We do believe, however, ESG as a framework, ESG can be a very, very useful value add. So again, I'm thinking ESG in the context of investment. I'm not thinking ESG in the context of political debate. And if you think about ESG in the investment framework, it would have a totally different meanings versus, again, you talk about DEI in the political context. So let's take a very, let's make a case of DEI in the Japanese business context. We are shrinking economy, we're shrinking population, we just don't have enough people. Companies just don't have enough people to hire, right? So the war for talent in Japan is very severe. We war for labor, we just don't have people. So does it make sense, economic sense for companies to look for the best talent out there, how do they do that? They should look for people, whether they're men or women, whether Japanese or non-Japanese, that are best trained, that are best educated, that are best talented, right? So DEI in the context of political debate becomes something very different. In the Japanese economic context, it becomes something else. It's a survival issue for Japanese companies. So that's how we look at this whole ESG debate, and that's how we look at ESG integration as a value add for our fund. We don't tell our companies in a portfolio to implement ESG elements into their business strategy because they want to check these boxes, because they want to be certified as great ESG friendly company. We tell them these are the ESG elements that will make you money. You're going to be able to grow. You're going to be able to grow your top line. You're going to be able to hire the best talent out there. You're going to be able to sell your products. Your profit is going to be good because these are very much economic issues. So that's how we look at the ESG discussion in the Japanese investment context for our fund. So that's a very different political argument that you would hear, and I'm sure with a new president and with a new administration in the United States, you probably have a very different discussion.
So I just want to, and I will open it up to general questions. I just want to follow up just briefly on one thing you just said, which is about the benefits of ESGE and how this is good for companies. Could you give like one or two examples of like how you would say it benefits?
I mean, the easiest one is just to show them how recruiting has direct impact when they actually have a very healthy ESG in the S society in terms of how inclusive and how open they are when it comes to recruiting and retention of people. So again, we go back to the comment I made earlier in terms of how the government is focusing on this jinteki shihon, that's an investment into human capital, and that makes it that can move the needle when you are starting a company or when you're growing a company, in terms of the access to the best talent pool. So that's actually a very much ESG issue, in economic sense. So especially in the Japanese economy, when where people are looking for talent, well, to some extent I think it's the same in the U.S., but at least U.S. population is growing. But in Japan, we're shrinking. We're 127 million people today. We're going to be below 100 million in 25 years, right? So that's it's already very visible in terms of how not only startups, but also in the public listed companies space, you see positive correlation between the for example, female representations at companies at different levels and profitability. I mean, there are enough data points to show that there is a positive correlation. Again, it's a little easier to look at these public companies because there are more data points than startups, but I think you can make a very clear business case